Welcome, everyone. This is Faithful Conversations about Abortion, a project of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa. I'm Connie Ryan, Executive Director of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa. We are very glad to have you join us to listen to some of Iowa's faith leaders. We hope you will allow it to inform and to challenge your own conversations in your community on abortion. Faithful Conversations is a video series and a tool, really, to help faith communities hold community conversations regarding access to reproductive health care, including abortion. It is a series of conversations with clergy from across Iowa on different aspects of the issues. Our goal is simple: to help communities of faith hold what may, on the surface, be difficult conversations, but to enable all of us to hold that conversation in a thoughtful manner, one that is free from political and divisive conversation. So let's get started. Today's conversation is creating faithful conversations on abortion, how to have difficult conversations, and holding space for divergent views. I have with me today Reverend Jill Michel, Reverend Lee Schott, and Rabbi Esther Hugenholtz. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
You bet. So let's dive right in. People of faith are often painted with one broad brush regarding beliefs about contraception and abortion care. Through the lens of your faith, briefly share with us your beliefs on the subject. And if you don't mind, I'm going to start with Reverend Lee Schott.
It's funny when you ask that question, Connie, the first thing that comes to mind is not so much coming out of my faith beliefs, but out of my understanding of human dignity, which I get is grounded in faith. But I think I believed that it was wrong to restrict abortion in ways that would cause women, because they will still seek abortions, to have to resort to back alley methods to end pregnancies. I knew about that when I was pretty little. I was 10 when Roe v. Wade was decided. And so I heard these stories and the stories of what it was like before that, and then what it was like, how that was going to change, really moved me as a pretty young girl. As I became more of a faith person and then a pastor, that stance feels consistent with what I know of my faith. That I don't want abortion to be this catch-all way of managing pregnancy. And I wish there were fewer. But when an abortion needs to happen, and I think we have to trust the woman to decide this, I think it's a real degradation of her dignity and good medical decisions and good mental health decisions to interfere with that. So my faith supports that interpretation of this question.
Thank you, Lee. Jill or Esther, do you want to chime in here?
You hear me?
Yeah, I'll just add. Oh.
Go ahead, Jill, and then we'll have Esther.
Okay. Just a couple of things as I think about my faith, and I'm turning 50 this year, so I didn't know a time without Roe v. Wade. And so not that hasn't meant that there have been conversations about abortion, but this certainly has changed them. And the things that I have come to identify, first of all, are that my faith is life affirming. So just as my faith causes me to feed the hungry and to house the homeless and to work to be anti-racist and to fight for equality for people of all gender identities and sexual orientations, so my faith causes me to affirm life in a big sense. Life doesn't just mean birth, but means all of life. And so that's the life of pregnant mothers. That's things like poverty and stress and broken relationships that have to be part of the conversation. I would even say the strain that humans put on creation has to be part of the conversation. So because I'm life affirming, I can't say that no pregnancy should be prevented, nor can I say that all pregnancies must go to term. And then I think the other thing is just that I've really learned that I'm a person of deep faith, and I have a responsibility to critique the places where the systems of my faith are broken. And so when limits on reproductive health care are used to keep women in their place, that's a sin of patriarchy. In this conversation, there are sins of white supremacy. And I don't believe that those are things that come from the heart of God or for Christians that Jesus modeled.
Thank you, Jill. Esther, you wanted to chime in here.
Yes, historically, Judaism has always had a legal thrust to its religious interpretation, meaning that we are not just a set of ideas and principles that we live out in the world as a Jewish community. There is legal material at the base of it because we legislate how we live our inner spiritual lives and bear that out into the world. Now, nowadays, there are many discussions among Jews to what degree Jewish law applies to our lives. But if we take a maximalist position where we consider Jewish law to be binding on our lives, even in those cases, we affirm full personhood to the mother and not to the fetus, which is not to say that the fetus isn't precious and isn't life and isn't beautiful and isn't holy. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have sanctity or value, but that in the moral equation, the interests of the pregnant woman or the pregnant person can never be subsumed to that of the fetus. We Jews define personhoods at first drawing of breath or at last drawing of breath at end of life decisions as well. And so we do not accept theologies that place ensoulment conception that's alien to Judaism. And we do not accept that the mother's interests should be subjugated to that of the unborn child, right? So that is the legal framework from which we are coming. And abortion in Judaism has a large spectrum of opinions attached to it. But for us to be able to live out our witness as a faith community, our existence as a faith community, we need abortion access because halakha, Jewish law, both accepts that abortions can happen and sometimes even mandate those abortions to happen if it is to save the mother's life. And so we need to live in a country and a society that guarantees our rights as a religious minority and not have a Christian majority philosophy imposed on us. In short, in Judaism, we consider the personhood of the living, breathing human being who's carrying the child to supersede the status of the fetus, which is not to say that we don't care about babies, which is not to say that we don't think pregnancy is beautiful, but that we will always stand with the pregnant woman in this.
Thank you, Esther. So why is it so difficult in our society have an open and honest and respectful conversation about abortion, particularly in faith communities? Anybody want to start on that?
Well, other than the reality that it seems, at least these days, to be difficult to have many open, honest, listening conversations, I think there's two things that come to mind for me. One is that somehow we have ended up, at least in American Christianity, with many people assuming that faith is about answers rather than questions, and about black and white rather than seeking and learning and growing. And so I think that for many people impedes their ability to have difficult conversations. And then I recognize that faith is a very personal thing. And if people don't have safe spaces to have those hard conversations, most of us tend to put up our protective gear and not be willing to engage them. So I think those are two things that play a role.
Thank you, Jill. Go ahead.
A mentor of mine used to say that all theology is autobiographical, which I don't think is quite true. But I think in this area, there's a couple things that are at play. One is there are quite a few people who I think have not had a personal experience that includes abortion. And so they don't really have that personal thing to draw on. And the stories that I hear where people do are really wrenching. And I don't know that everyone trusts that that's true. And that feels hard, I think, for some people. And so the distance of it for many people, it's easy to talk about what other people ought to do rather than something that you may have had to deal with. And then even for people who have had that experience, those conversations haven't always been welcomed because of the dividedness we have on this subject. So there are people they might tell, but many friends probably don't know how close we are to others who have had to make that decision.
I also think that sometimes in a Christian majority society, there is not enough critical questioning about what it means to have one faith be dominant in political discourse, in social discourse, and in the cultural discourse. And this, for me as a Jew, this is important. And also for all of my brothers and sisters and siblings of other minority faith communities. I can't speak on their behalf, but I'll certainly stand in solidarity with Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and people of no belief and humanists and atheists whose religious rights are also being negated by this Christian-centric worldview. But in general, I think people's thinking philosophically is quite fuzzy, right? We all are concerned about life that is beautiful and vulnerable and new, but and that moral impulse, I think, for many people is really genuine, right? Like, I am a mother. I have 3 children. I've had 3 pregnancies. I know how precious and beautiful that is when you get your first ultrasound. And I think we sometimes don't always do a good job in our culture of saying that those feelings may be very compelling, but we are not operating just on feelings. We are operating in a framework where we are trying to create a society with the common good, and your feelings, as compelling as they might be for you, may not apply to someone else who holds different definitions. I also think that philosophically, abortion is a really difficult issue. I think when you apply the frame of bioethics to abortion, it is a morally complicated issue. And I think we struggle in our culture to hold the shades of gray, where we can acknowledge that it's a difficult issue because you're talking about an entity in a person's body that is 50% their DNA and 50% not their DNA, that has some status outside of the person carrying it, but is also wholly dependent on it. And so I also think it's about how we have those conversations where we say, we understand that we all want to protect life. I think if we are outcome driven, we will be far more successful. If we truly want to create a world that's better and safer for young parents with babies and unexpected pregnancies, then we should build that world through universal health care, paternity and maternity leave, and other social provisions that we can implement that will actually help babies who are already born, who have come into the world, and their families.
See, I told you not to turn your mic off, and I did that as well. My apologies. So thank you very much for your answers on that. Setting abortion aside, I want to talk a little bit about how you have approached difficult conversations around an opposing view, and whether that's in your faith community or just in your life in general, and how you have handled that. How have you navigated that when you're talking with somebody that you care about on an important issue, not abortion, and what that looked like for you, how you approached that?
Yeah, I'm willing to speak on that. I think starting with the desired outcome and working your way back can be a really effective strategy. So, most human beings will be in agreement that we want to live in a world of peace and prosperity, a world where we respect each other, where we love each other. And of course, we're going to have different ideas of how we build that world or how we get that world. But I think reaching across the aisle with empathy, right? As I understand why people are pro-life, if we want to use that term. I understand why people deeply care for the unborn. I have a lot of empathy with that position. And so I think in terms of other discussions that I have had on difficult topics, whatever it may be, in my community or beyond my community, is saying, tell me what you're afraid of and tell me what you hope for. If you tell me what you're afraid of, then we can maybe look at whether that fear is actually called for or what drives that fear, and tell me what you hope for, then we can build towards that together. And like, maybe you'll find that actually you have a lot more in common, and that when you do disagree, you can disagree from a place of principle rather than anger. I mean, obviously, this is a really tall order. I haven't figured it all out. Either this is incredibly divided society, and I'm not even American. I'm an immigrant. I'm still learning as I speak. But just like making space to say, okay, we're going to intentionally hold that space. Say, what drives you? I want to know about you. Will you give me a chance for me to share what drives me?
Thank you so much. Lee or Jill?
You kind of got to where I was thinking, Esther, that I'm always really interested in knowing what are the experiences that lead us to where we stand. Because I think once we kind of understand where people have been, it's easier to, well, for one thing, we can honor that and whatever, hardship or joy or whatever goes with that. But it gives us a place then to share our own experience. So that helps, in my experience, on any kind of conversation like this, is to not just start with the issue, but make space for people to share a story that connects with the actual thing that is kind of in dispute in our midst.
Thank you. So have you been part of a conversation, either a group conversation or individually, around reproductive health care and access to safe and legal abortion in your faith community? And what did that look like if you did?
So last year, after the Supreme Court decision, we did just a 3-week conversation series that we called Faithful Conversations on Difficult Topics. So, and did focus that on reproductive health care. So just kind of a quick overview of what we did. Of course, where we started was setting some ground rules and covenanting to follow those. And you all are familiar with those things like, listening more than we speak, and those of us who have paragraphs, leaving space for those who need a few minutes pause, and as well as things like speaking for ourselves and listening to understand, confidentiality, honoring the truth of people's stories. So then we met for 3 weeks, and the first week that we met, we started with storytelling. And we really started with the question, why are you in this conversation today? And then that simple question led to all sorts of sharing, including for some people, their own experiences with abortion. The second week that we met was really much more full of content. So we started the first half talking about facts and myths and propaganda. We talked about, the reality that choices in reproductive care and with abortion are complex. And we're really fortunate that we have an abortion care doctor in the congregation. And so she helped us navigate some of those conversations. And then we spent the second half of that time talking about how our faith informs this. A little bit about what the Bible has to say, which isn't a lot. And then we talked about the core beliefs of our faith. And for us, as part of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, we talked about how these conversations about abortion and reproductive health care have happened within our denomination. So one of the things that was helpful to us is that we're a denomination that started as a movement for unity. And so we have core beliefs like everyone's welcome at the table, and we expect there to be different perspectives. And one of our core beliefs is a commitment to the freedom of individual choice. So those informed our conversation. And then the third week, we really said, so what? We can talk about it in the safety of our space all day long. And so that was partially, what things did you hear, or we had suggested some reading that challenged you, that caused you to see things differently. And then also, what actions might we individually and as a community take? So it was, and I would say, our conversations were really good. For us, the biggest struggle was that while there were nuances of difference, the people who joined the conversation were largely from one perspective, which made them beautiful conversations, but didn't necessarily allow us to dive fully into the really hard places of those conversations.
It's one of the things that makes this experience hard, right? Like around so many subjects that we end up talking to people we've already kind of carved out a place to be with that we agree with. And I'm sorry that that's happened so widely.
I mean, for us, this conversation cannot be disconnected from our concerns about religious freedom, being a minority community. And I know I bring it back to that a lot, but that's because it's really important for our community. Some synagogues have even made that legal claim in the courts of the land that to strip away the Jewish community from abortion rights, because, communities in general are being stripped of these rights, deprives us of core tenets of our faith. And so I think it's really important to cast this in theological language, that it is part of the divine will of our revealed Holy Torah that the woman's life takes precedence over the child. And that has been a consistent thread throughout the Jewish interpretive tradition. Some people might be a bit more liberal on that. Other people might be a bit more conservative on that. But that has been the focus. And we really need to have a conversation about the dominance of a certain type of Christianity in the marketplace of ideas and in the halls of power, which may not correspond demographically with where this country is and where this country is going. And so as a Jew, I need to know that I am free to practice my faith in America according to the dictates of my conscience that my Holy Torah equips me, because the God I believe in is the God who is with the pregnant person, the God who will stand by the pregnant woman in her hour of need and empowers us to make really difficult but really important decisions. Now, in my community, there is less tension around this issue. There are Jewish communities where that might be more the case, but in my community, that has not been the case. For me, my role is more educational, that I try to teach my own Jewish community about how Jewish law empowers us to fight for reproductive rights, and where our minority status as a vulnerable minority fits into that, and how we have a moral obligation to stand up for all minorities and all vulnerable people. And for us, this really is a justice issue.
Esther, you alluded to the majority Christian opinion, and that's an odd way that, in some ways we're sort of connected, because those of us who have a more progressive stance on this issue and so many issues, we get left out of the conversation because Christianity supposedly teaches that you can't have abortions. And for many of us, that's simply not true, as in other other subjects as well. So that's another whole overlay to this that's just so complicated for, I think, us today.
Absolutely. And I want to speak to both of you as Christian clergy, right? That what Jill was saying is that absolutely right. The Bible doesn't speak about abortion. Now, the Bible does, and by the Bible, I mean the Hebrew Bible, which you all would call the Old Testament. I would say that the original is always better than the sequel. But I'm just joking. But that's because I'm a wounded Star Wars fan, and well. But in the Hebrew Bible, the only place where we get a legal ruling on anything related to pregnancy loss is in the book of Exodus, chapter 21, verse 22, which actually supports a pro-choice argument, right? Because the text goes into, if two men fight and they accidentally cause a miscarriage in a pregnant woman by striking her abdomen, and she miscarries the child, what is the liability and the consequence of that miscarriage? And this is embedded in a chapter on tort law that talks about life for life punishments, right? If in other settings, if a human being takes the life of another human being, then there is a certain punishment exacted for that. In ancient times, sometimes that would have been the death penalty. Not always. I'm not approving of the death penalty. I'm just saying that in the context of the legal argument being made, that was the death penalty. In the case of the woman who miscarries, it's monetary loss, precisely because we do not equate life for life. We do not equate nefesh b'nefesh, as we would say in Hebrew, personhood for personhood. The baby, as tragic and horrible and horrifying as that accidental miscarriage is, and it is recognized as a trauma and as a loss because there's compensation for it. The compensation is not life for life because we do not ascribe personhood to the fetus. And we do ascribe personhood to the woman. If the woman had been killed, then it would have been life for life. So I think it's also really important for progressive and liberal Christians to delve into that legal material, into scripture, in order to have a theological countervailing point, right? This is not just about what we believe on a personal level. This is actually sound exegesis that we are engaging with in the biblical text. And so, you know, we know the development of the pro-life argument or the anti-abortion argument, but we really need to root ourselves in our own texts and say, this is the only text in the entire Hebrew Bible that speaks to abortion from a legal standpoint. I'm not talking about, you know, homiletical texts like Jeremiah, you know, I knew you in the womb. We do not derive legal things from that. That's just a beautiful poetic sentiment. But exegetically, that's different. But that is the core text. And we as biblical people, let's call us that, you know, whether you're Christian or a Jew, if you're rooted in the call for justice of the Hebrew Bible, then you need to go back to learning that text and really understanding it, and appreciating that the Bible, whether that's expressed the new covenant through Jesus Christ or the remaining covenant through the Torah and the God of Israel, we are both so concerned with justice and equity and love and compassion, and those should be the drivers of the conversation.
So I want to take this back to this idea that the difficult conversations and how to hold those, and I think you're exactly right, Esther, of grounding yourself. If you're having a conversation in a faith community, grounding yourself in your own faith and sacred texts that are associated with that, wherever you come from on the spectrum of beliefs on this issue, and because let's be real, it is not like here and here. It is a spectrum of beliefs for the totality of folks. And so how, as faith leaders, how can other faith leaders approach or model conversations about reproductive health care, including access to safe and legal abortion? What are your tips? And you've named some already in the conversation, and you can rename them or add more. But what are the tips or suggestions that you would share how to have those faithful conversations?
I think whenever we're talking about hard conversations, we have to figure out how we're going to hold space to hear each other. And that means kind of creating, we've done things like peace circles or having a talking stick, some kind of a thing that gets passed so that everybody gets a chance to be heard. And there's some just built-in respect and protection of everyone's voice. I think a lot of times when we've been heard, then we're more willing to hear what other people have to say, and also to trust the process of the group to make a decision, even if it's not one that we completely agree with, because of the respect that we've received. So I have found that to be a really important piece of that process.
Jill?
Well, and connected to that, I would say as leaders, having a non-anxious presence and being a non-anxious presence is just, that feels like we shouldn't have to name that. But having a commitment to that, just accepting that these are difficult, messy conversations and that they matter. And grounding ourselves.
And what I hear in what you said is that we can still love each other. And as the leader, we love that person, even if they say something that we might really disagree with. And they probably have some sense of what we believe before they begin talking. And that the relationship matters no matter how this issue comes out, how this conversation comes out. And sometimes I think we haven't made that safe. So I love what you said about non-anxious. That's really important.
I would like to broaden the scope a little bit, right? Because for my community, it is a little different. But I also think what we should be doing is broadening the conversations. I'm very aware that we as progressive clergy or progressive faith communities can form a really important bridge between faith communities that might really struggle with this issue or that might skew more conservative on this issue, but also the secular world out there. I'm a European. I come from a very secular context, and America is secularizing at a really quick rate. And what I want to let America know is that whether you're young, secular, or disenchanted with religion, or angry with religion for all the right reasons that we can be angry with religion, because monotheism it needs a little of a PR overhaul, is that we are here to be with you and to walk with you and to fight with you and to march with you and to listen to you and to help with practical aid. And that's what I want the people who are not in our circles to do. I want that young teenager who finds herself pregnant, I want her to know that I'm here for her to help her and support her, right? I want this young or not young or whatever person it is, whatever gender identity or whatever situation they find themselves in, that we are here to uplift you and to help you navigate painful things or hard things in your life, because that is what compassionate religion is about. It's about creating a soft space to fall, soft space to land, and to be and to unfold your humanity. And that's what we're here to do. And I think sometimes we liberal religionists need to have a bit more oomph, right, to stake that out, because I think it's very easy for people to weaponize religiosity who have loud voices. And I think we also need to have a loud voice and stand on principle. And the best principles are those that are the hardest to hold. I will be very honest. I do not like talking about abortion. I never thought abortion would be the key signature issue that I would be working on, fighting on, campaigning on, because it is hard. It is a genuinely hard issue, and I'm a mom, and I'm really glad that I've been able to build the family that I have in the way that I have. But I said to my congregation, that's exactly why we need to talk about this, because easy principles are easy to hold, but the hard principles are really important to hold, because that is where our humanity is most challenged, and that is where we need to stake ourselves and root ourselves in the name of justice and love.
Any other last ideas that you have for tips on having these difficult conversations within the context of your faith community?
I didn't say this before, but I thought I probably should have. And I appreciate, Esther, how you've talked about, being grounded in the scriptures, being grounded in this understanding of what the law is. If I'm going to have that hard conversation, it's going to include some real work to identify those resources. What is our faith? What does the Bible say about this? What does our faith say about this? What are the stories in our tradition that connect to this? So it's not just unrooted and untethered. And that has always been really helpful, I think, for people to hear some of those stories that we haven't always remembered. Like when you give that scripture, Esther, I don't think many of us have thought very much about that. There was a line at the beginning of a Bible study I used to teach that the ground rules included these words. It was about Bible study, but it's fitting for this too. It was the idea that our differences among us when we have a conversation about a biblical text are going to trouble us more than they trouble God. And I loved that sense that, like, we're going to have a hard conversation, but God's big enough to hold a lot of different opinions and perspectives. And I always appreciated that wisdom. I think that applies here too.
Thank you so much for adding that in. I think that's really important. I'm going to close there and thank each of you so much for being part of this conversation. Reverend Lee Schott, Rabbi Esther Hugenholtz, Rabbi Jill Michel.
Wait, you got turned into a rabbi, Jill.
Oops, did I say that?
I was going to just let that sneak past.
I am so sorry. Let me start that over. Reverend Lee Schott, Rabbi Esther Hugenholtz, and Reverend Jill Michel. My apologies. I just wrote down a roll, I guess.
Yeah, Jesus was a rabbi too. It's all good.
Yeah, right. Thank you to each of you. And again, our goal with Faithful Conversations about abortion is to help communities of faith hold what may on the surface be difficult conversations. And we hope that you will use all of the videos to continue those conversations or start those conversations wherever you are on that journey in your faith community. Very much appreciate you spending time with us. Thank you for watching today. And thank you for your willingness to listen and engage in the conversations. It is important. For more information about this work and Interfaith Alliance of Iowa, you can go to our website, interfaithallianceiowa.org, and you can find more information about this project and all of the projects and work that we do as an organization. And so again, thank you to each of our speakers today. And thank you for listening and watching. Appreciate that. Take care and goodbye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.